We're now on Daf Chesamid Beis, and we're trying to figure out if there could be a possibility of Tumah with Mishkav and Moshe, the full blast Tumah, and yet no requirement of Sfira Zayin Nikiyim. And the Gemara says, Shomeres Yom Keneged Yom Tochiach. Here's a case, a precedent. Shemitama Mishkav Moshe. It means that a woman who sees dam, not be'es nidasa, shalo be'es nidasa, and she's considered a Zava Kana. She has all the dinim of Tumas Ziva, but she doesn't require Zayin Nikiyim. She doesn't require bringing a carbon. She just counts one Yom Naki, and then she's Toveles. And there are 11 days between one Machzor and another Machzor of Yemein Nidus. Is Eina Te'una, V'Eina Te'una Sfira Zayin Nikiyim. And therefore, Afata, therefore you could have such a Hamamina, Al Titma, Al Zavzeh. He saw two Re'ios, She'afal Pish Betame, Mishkav Moshev, Lo Yehi Ton, Sfiras, Zayin Nikiyim. I need a special person to teach me that a Zav who saw two Re'ios requires Zayin Nikiyim. Tamalomer, and therefore we need that person to teach this from Mizovo Safar. And Mizovo, the mem, as we said, is Miktsazova, which means he only saw two Re'ios. And the Safar, nevertheless, he has to count Zayin Nikiyim, Limit al Zav, Bal Shteria Sheton, Shiva Nikiyim. Amalei Rav Papa Abaye, Maishno Hai. What's the difference between Mizovo, which is here in the parsha of Sfira Zayin Nikiyim, the Marbele Zav Bal Shteria? We're going to use the Mizovo to teach me a ribui, that a Zav Bal Shteris requires Zayin Nikiyim before he can go and be Tovel himself. Umayshna Hai Mizovo, but then we have the Mizovo with regard to the carbon, the Memayit Bey, Zav Bal Shteris, and we use the word Mizovo to set up two categories, one of which is Mikta Zav that does not bring a carbon, that's Shteris, as opposed to a full-fledged Zav, so previous and has to bring a carbon. Amalei Abai says to Rav Papa in response to this question, Isal Kedaitach Hai Limaute Udiasa Lishto Krabine. If you're going to tell me that the word Mizovo with regard to Zayin Nikiyim is coming as a mute to establish that a Zav Bal Shteris does not need Sfira Zayin Nikiyim, then the Torah shouldn't have said anything. Didn't have to add the word Mizovo. We would have understood Megilla that there's no Chiyuv Sfira. In other words, what would generate a Chiyuv Sfira? And if you'll ask me the following question, even without this word, Mizovo, even in the absence of that extra word, we would certainly logically come to the conclusion that Zav Bal Shteris is Chayv in Sfira because he's Metami Tumas Mishkav Moshe. So then I'm going to again invoke the case of Shomeres Yom Keneged Yom as a precedent for someone who is Shomeres Yom Keneged Yom Tochiach, even though she's Metame Tumas Mishkav Moshe, nevertheless she does not require Sfiras Nikiyim. Shiva Nikiyim, V'chi Tema, and Abaye adds the following statement, and if you'll want to say the following, Hai mi boile Mizovo v'lo mi nigo, perhaps we need the word Mizovo for a drasha to teach me v'lo mi nigo that if there's an overlap between the Tumah Chamur of Zav and the Tumah of Mitzorah, then he can be Mitayr himself from that Tumah Chamur of Zav, even though he's still a Mitzorah, and therefore we could not learn from this pasuk a ribui for Zav Bal Shteris that he requires Sfira Zayin Nikiyim. Im came Lichtov Kra. If that be the case, then the Torah could have just said V'chi Yitar Hazah. The Lishtov. The Torah did not have to add the word Mizova. And we've been medayik from the pasuk that it's enough that he's medayik himself from his ziva, and he doesn't require anything else, even though there's still a negatzaras. Abai therefore concludes by saying Mizovo. The Torah adds the word Mizovo Lomali to teach me what Limet al Zav Bal Shteris Sfira Zayin Nikiyim. Now we pick up the mission of Ein Bain with regard to Mitzorah. And we have two categories of Mitzoras. We'll soon see a Mitzorah Muskar and a Mitzorah Muchla. what are the differences between a person who has a leidas nega, which is a suffix, saras, and he has to wait Zayin Nikiyah behezger until the Kohen will see him a second time around, as opposed, in contrast to a person who is a mitzora vada. Now, in order to explain this sugya, let's introduce the following hakdamos as far as the dinim of mitzora is concerned. The Rambam really spells this out in Hilchos Tumas Tzaras. Number one, how does a person become a mitzora? He has a manifestation of a nega ba'or in his skin. This is for dermatologists, right? And he's brought to the Kohen. Now, the Kohen is going to take a look at the nega, investigate it, and he's going to try to figure out whether or not this is certainly a tumas nega. If he determines that it's vaday a tumas nega, then immediately he will be mitameh. For example, let's say he has a mara nega with simone tuma, and then right now all the dinim of what's called the mitzvah muchlar chal on him for all the inyanim. But in other occasions, there's still a suffix with them. For example, he doesn't have simone tuma. Well, then we have what's called a mitzora muzgar, which means that the Kohen would determine and declare that he needs hezger, he's going to be quarantined for 7 days, and he's a mitzora muzgar. Now, during that 7-day period, the din of mitzora muzgar is exactly the same as the din of mitzora muchla, except for one exception, that's called priya uprima. And priya uprima, as we'll see in the Mishnah, does not apply to a muzgar, it only applies to a muchla. Now, after the 7 days, the Kohen checks out the nega second time around, and if it has simone tuma, there are 3 different simone tuma, there's ser lavan, pasar chai, pasar nega. So then he's mitame him b'taras vada. He's no longer a muzgar, basically a muchla. And if the nega remains in that state without any change, then there's going to be another hezger of 7 days, an additional quarantine of 7 days. And if after the 7 days, the nega still remains exactly as it was, then he becomes tar. That's part of the paradox of Sarah. In any event, a mitzora has the din of an av hatum, is mitame adam ubegadu, and there's an extra chumrah in mitzora that he's mitame bebia. In other words, if he comes into a house, then by entering into the house, he's contaminates everything that's in the house, whether it's adam or kelim, and they become what's called a rishon hatum. Another additional chumrah in Saras is that he's mishtalech michutz legimel machnas. He's got to be sent not only beyond the confines of the Machna Shechina, which is the Migdash, or the Harvais, which is called Machna Levia, but Yerushalayim, which is Machna Yisrael. He's got to be expelled, so to speak, from even Machna Yisrael. And that din applies only in what's called an Ir Hamukefes Chomi Mosi Yoshuv Ben Nun. Now, when he stays and sits outside the city, he has to do what's called Priyas Harosh v'Primas B'Goda. Now, as far as the Tara of Mitzvah is concerned, once he's Nitar, if let's say he's Mitzvah Muchla, and he's Nitar Minigo, which means that his Nega was healed, then he has to bring Shtei Tziporim, 8 Erez, Shni Tolas, the Azov. And the Kohen will command the shchita of one tzipor, takes the other tzipor and dips it together with the other minim that we mentioned, the eitz eres, the shnita las, and the azov into the dama tzipor shchuta. And from that concoction, they do hazah on the mitzora. They send away the bird that's alive, and afterwards they do what's called tiglachas mitzora. in which they take off all the hairs on his body. He's Tovil Tefillah Rishona, and he's Machabis B'Gadol. Now he's allowed to come into the Mach. After 7 days, he has a second Giluach, again, all the hairs on his body, and he does a second Tefillah and Kibbutz B'Gadol. Now he's completely tar from his tumah. However, he still is a mechutza kapara, like we discussed earlier in the case of Zav, and he's not allowed to enter the Migdash or Yikoshim until he brings 3 karbanos, a chatos, an osham, and an ola, all of which are brought on the 8th day. The Mishnah says, Ein bein mitzora muzgar, who is muzgar for 7 days, limitzora muchlat. Muchlat means we already decided with absolute certainty that he is in fact a mitzora. Ella priya uprima. A mitzora muchlat needs priyas harash and primas, which means ripping b'gadiv, where muzgar is not chayav. Ein bein tar mitoch hezger, litar mitoch hechlet, ela tiglachas v'tziporin. Now the Mishnah is comparing a mitzora who became tar mitoch hezger. He was a mitzora muzgar that we described earlier, lo nolad bo simoni tuma. And then we have a case of mitzora becomes tar mitoch hechlet. He was a mitzora muchlat, and then he was healed from his nega. The difference between these two is tiglachas v'tzipor. Muchlat, when he comes to be mitar himself, he needs to come into the Beis Hamikdash and shave off all the hair of his body and bring these 2 tziporim. But a mitzora muskar becomes immediately tar from his hezger, and he's potter from the tiglachas and the shnei tziporim. So the Gemara is now medayik from the words of the Mishnah. Hol inyan shiluach, as far as sending the mitzora chutz le'ir, vidine tuma, all the extra chumras of tzaras, zev v'zeh shavin. There's no difference between a muzgar and a muchlat. They're both obligated to be sent out of 3 machnos, and they have all the chumras of tumas mitzora. And the Gemara asked me, how do we know this? The Tani, we learned in Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchok, Kamei de Rav Huna, meaning Rav Shmuel presented a brisa in the presence of Rav Huna. And this brisa addresses the case of mitzora who became tar mitoch hezger. And the pasuk says, "V'tiaro hakohen mispachas hi v'chibes b'gadov v'taher." Now the pasuk uses a lashon avar, and it says v'taher. It doesn't use a lashon asid v'yithar. So we're going to derive the conclusion: what is the intention here of the Torah? Tar mafria umafrima demeikara. Even before Tvila, if he was a muskar, he is tar. What does that mean? He's tar. And it's before Tvila. He's a muskar. What does it mean? He's tar. He's tar from mixas dine tumachal taras. There's certain dinim of a mitzvah that don't apply to the muskar. And that's what the pasuk is telling us about dine priya uprima. That they don't apply, these requirements don't apply to a muskar, they only apply to a muchla. Normally, Rava now raises the following objection to the drasha of Shmuel Bar Yitzchak. Elmiat, according to your understanding that pasuk vitar is teaching us on a Tara that was earlier, that was mikodem lachem, is called a meikara, meaning before Tvila he was a muskar. And then Elameata, then a Gabizah, who became tar from his tumah on the 7th day. Tichsiv v'chibes b'gadov v'taher. Again, we have this pasuk of Echiles B'Gad Rachim Psor V'Mayim V'Chaim V'Toher is Hasam Mai V'Toher Meikar Iko. You're saying that the word V'Toher means Meikara, because it doesn't say Yitar, but V'Toher. So how do we apply this rule of interpreting V'Toher as Meikara in the case of a Tara that was Chal beforehand? You can't tell me now that V'Toher Meikara. Ella, we have no choice but to interpret the word V'Toher not on the Avar, but rather on the Asid, meaning Tar Hashta Militame Kli Cheres Be'esed. So it's on the Asid that he's tar for the Asid as far as being Mitame Mikal Haba Kli Cheres Be'esed. Which Kli Cheres Be'esed means that if he moves like Kli Cheres, Ahaz's Kli Cheres, then Li'achar Shetaval L'Kar Mizov Lo Yutfreim Be'Seita. This concept of Tumas Hesed will no longer apply. And what's the Chiddush? Afal Gav the Hader Chazi Lo Mitami L'Mafreya. Even if he comes back and he examines the Tumas Zav on that seventh day, and he sees that he has a Tumas Zav, he has a Tumas Zav. So then he's soser his minion L'Mafreya. But that Kli Cheres Shehisid Bein Tfiloso L'Riyoso, that Kli is not Tomit. It's Hachinami. In the case of a Mitzorah Muzga, likewise, we'll interpret it that V'Torah means Tar Hashta Milutami V'Bilam Afreya. That if the Kohen is Mitzorah the Mitzorah Muzgar, and then he's Tovel in order to completely purify himself, then he goes into a bias Chiyech Hamad V'Kelim, Uliachar Mikan, Chazar V'Noga, Uposha V'Gufo, is this din is equivalent to Nitma L'Mafreya. And nevertheless, Adam L'Kelim, who were with him in the bias, Inam Tmeim. Why is that so? So because of this question, the Gemara quotes Rava, who offers a different source for the halacha that Mitzorah Muzgar is parted from Prima Uprima. Elama Rava Mehacha. Let's derive this from a different passage. It says, "Vatzaru asher bo anoga, anega b'gad of you prumim v'roshia parua," and it says, "Hatzarua asher bo." Well, what's the extra word bo? As if to be mamait that only in this context is there priya and prima. Mishet tzarasa tluya begufo. This means a mitzvah muchlat, because as long as his nega is still active and he hasn't had he hasn't achieved this successful refuah begufo of his saras, he's still omi b'tumaso. Yotzezeh, now we're excluding a mitzvah muzgar she'ein sarato tluya begufo ela b'shivas yom. For the case of Mitzorah Muzgar, where we need Hezger of Shivas Yamin, is in Lo Yimtza B'nega Simone Tuma at the end of the 7 days, Yitarenu HaKohen. Even though, again, the Nega is still there. So Abaye asks a kasha to Rava on Rava. According to your logic that the word bo means that the nega is totally begufo, how are you going to interpret the pasuk? Kol yemei asher nega bo yitma tomehu bodod yeshev michutz lamachne moshavo. Are you going to tell me that mishat sarata tluya begufo uteton shiluach and she'ein sarato tluya begufo? That means the muskar is ein ton shiluach. And if that's what you're going to say is true, then Valktani, what are you going to do with that Mishnah? Implying that the Indian Shiluach and also to be Mitam Bia when he enters into a house and he's Mitam the Adam in the house, Zev is Shavim. Both a Musgar and a Mukhlan are equivalents. You see that there's a din of Shiluach even in a Musgar against Rava. Rava answers, Amalei Yemei, Kol Yemei, L'Rabos Mitzora Musgar L'Shiluach. Again, as far as the pasuk of Asher Naga Hanega Bo is concerned, then we would have excluded Mitzora Musgar from Shiluach. But since the Torah should have written Mi Asher Hanega Bo Yitma, and it adds Kol Yomai, so we're going to derive from that L'Rabos Af Mitzora Musgar L'Shiluach. So Gemara says, if the word kol is coming as a reboot for the case of a Mitzora Muzgar, to teach me that the din of Shiluach applies, is Tiglachas B'tziparim, my time alone. Right? The Mitzora Muchlat, in order to achieve Tara, he has to bring Tziparim and he has to undergo Tiglachas. Is my time alone? What's the reason that we shouldn't be noeg in Musgar these same requirements? The Katani ein bein tar mitoch hezger letar mitoch heflet ela tiglachas b'tziparim. So we see clearly that your argument that kol is coming as a ribui, that a Mitzora Muchskar needs Shiluach, but what are you going to say about Tiglachas B'tziparim? I mean, that applies as a chiv to Muchlat. Why not apply it to a Muzkar? And the Mishnah says we don't apply it to a Muzkar. Omar Abaye answers, Omar Kra, the Torah says, V'yotza kohen al michutz l'machne, v'ra'ah kohen, v'hine nirpa nega tzara atzaras min atzaruah. And in these psukim, and the ones afterwards, there's a dinim of tiglachas and tziporim. And since the pasuk says nirpa nega atzaras, we derive from that this din, this halachic requirement of tiglachas and tziporim only applies b'misha tzarato tluya b'refuasa. That the refuas haguf from this nega, which means that in Mitzora Muchlat, he's not tar misaraso until Achir Pirgin to go. Yotzezeh, this is excluding the Mitzora Muzgar, Shein Tzarato Tluya b'refuas el b'yomim. Everything depends upon Shivas Yomim. And even if Lopasa Nega, he's tar. And now we go on to the next Ein Ben. And this has to do with Sifrei Torah, Nevi'im, Ksuvim, Tefillin, Mezuzahs. Ein Ben Sfarim, L'Tefillin and Mezuzahs. Sfarim means Tanakh, as opposed to Tefillin and Mezuzahs. Ella Shasfarim Nichtav B'chol Lashon, U'Tefillin and Mezuzahs Ein Nichtavos Ella Ashuris, only with a ksav ashuris. So that Sfarim can be written in any language whatsoever, whereas Tefillin and Mezuzahs have to be written in Ashuris and Lashon Kodesh. And then the Mishnah records the Shita of Reb Shimon Gamliel, Af b'Sfarim lo itirchi kosfu ela Yevanis. Not every language is kosher, is appropriate for Sfarim, but rather we only isolate one particular language, and that's Yevanis. So the Gemara's Medaik Holik Ofran Begidin L'Tamias Yadayim Zebezet Shavim. Apparently, the Mishnah would equate Tefillin and Mezuzahs with Sfarim as far as Tefira is concerned, to be taught for the Uriel Zulazu, and as far as Gidin is concerned, of a Behem or a Chayat Tahura, and as far as L'Tamias Yadayim, that Kisvei HaKodesh, they made Xera of Tumas Yadayim, Zebezet Shavim, Sfarim, Tefillin, Mezuzahs are all equal. And just like Tefillin and Mezuzahs need Tefira Begidin and the Metame Yadayim, so the same din applies to Sfarim. And the Gemara says now, Sfarim Nichtav B'chol Lashon, Reminu, I'm going to ask you a steer from a Brisa, Mikra, it's a pasuk that's written in Lashon Kodesh, Ksavo Targum, it was written in Aramaic, V'chein Targum, which are tevos that are written in Aramaic. Going Yegar Sadu, such a Ksavo Mikra, was written in Lashon Kodesh, which means that instead of writing the word God, Yegar Sadusi wrote the word Gal-Eid. And in these two cases, he was Meshana the Lashon, not the Ksav. Or he was Meshana the Ksav, not the Lashon. For example, he wrote it B'Lashon Kodesh, but B'Ksav Ivri changed the script. And the Ksav Ivri of Yoshvei Ever Hana. So this Sefer is not Metamis Yadayim, it doesn't have the status of Kisvei HaKodesh. Ad Sheikh Yitavenu B'Ksav Ashuris, Ala Sefer Ubidyo. So we have three qualifications, three requirements in order to set it up as a Sefer, as Kisvei Kodesh, that's Metamis Yadayim. It's got to be Ksav Ashuris, it's got to be on cloth, and it's got to be with ink, with yo. Anyway, we see clearly from this brisa that Shini Lashon disqualifies the Sefer, which is against the Mishnah that Sfarim Nichtav B'chol Lashon. Amar Rava Lo Kasha, this is not a steer between the Mishnah and the brisa, because each one is dealing with a different case. Here on Daf Tesam and Al Kan Begufo Shalonu, Kan Begufo Shalahem. Our Mishnah is talking about if a case we wrote Sfarim with our Ksiva, which is called Ksav Ashuris, and he only changed the language but not the Ksav, and if the Sefer is kosher, but the Bryce is talking a case where he wrote Sfarim Begofan Shalahem in their Ksiva, in that strange language, and he was Mishana not only the Lashon, but also the Ksav. And in such a case, the Sefer is not considered, it's not upgraded to the status of Kisvei HaKodesh, and therefore it's not Metame Yodayim. So this is we're going to stop here on the top of Daf Tes with Amalei Abaye, and Abaye is now going to disagree with that answer.